Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey through the diverse landscape of psychology.
That's right.
We'll be charting the major perspectives and the fundamental ways psychologists approach understanding the mind and behavior.
Exactly. Think of this as your concise yet comprehensive guide to the core ideas, the ones that have really shaped how we study what makes us tick.
Right.
We'll be exploring everything from the earliest attempts to grasp consciousness right up to the multitude of specialized fields we see today.
And we've gathered a rich array of sources for this. Textbooks, video transcripts, some really insightful discussions.
A good mix.
Yeah, and our aim here, our mission, if you like, is to give you a clear, insightful understanding of this fascinating field, sort of cutting through the potential information overload.
Makes sense.
Okay, so to kick us off, where did this whole quest to understand the mind actually begin?
Well, in its earliest stages, psychology was deeply concerned with the nature of conscious experience itself. The initial focus was really on trying to dissect and understand what it meant to be aware.
And that's where structuralism comes in, right? This idea of understanding consciousness by looking inward.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Structuralism's goal was essentially to break down conscious experience into its fundamental elements, things like sensations, feelings.
How did they do that?
The primary method was introspection. Basically, trained individuals would carefully reflect on and report their own thoughts and feelings in response to specific stimuli.
That sounds, well, pretty subjective. Were there challenges with that approach?
That's a key point, yeah. While structuralism was an important early step, trying to be systematic about the mind, its reliance on subjective self-reporting proved quite unreliable. It was just too difficult to standardize those internal experiences across different people. And ultimately, that subjectivity limited its scientific rigor. It sort of paved the way for more objective approaches, like behaviorism, which focused on what you could actually see and measure.
Okay, makes sense. So, moving away from the internal, let's talk Sigmund Freud. His ideas, controversial perhaps, but they've certainly left a lasting mark.
Oh, absolutely. Freud remains a pivotal figure. His groundbreaking work laid out the foundations of the psychoanalytic perspective.
And central to that is the unconscious mind, isn't it? This hidden realm influencing so much of what we do.
Exactly. Freud's psychoanalytic perspective put immense emphasis on the power of the unconscious, and also how experiences in early childhood can have this profound, often unrecognized impact on our adult motivations and behaviors.
And psychoanalysis itself, the therapy.
Right. He developed that as a method, encouraging patients to talk freely about their experiences, believing this process could bring unconscious conflicts, bubble them up to the surface.
It's interesting, though, how some of his specific theories have been, well, challenged over time.
That's very true. Some of his more specific interpretations, like the details of the Oedipus complex, have certainly faced scrutiny and aren't widely accepted today.
But the broader ideas.
Exactly. Many of his broader concepts continue to resonate and actually find support in contemporary research. Things like the fundamental importance of early childhood experiences shaping us.
Right.
The idea of a constant push and pull between unconscious desires and conscious thoughts. How these internal drives can lead to psychological conflict. How our mental representations of ourselves and others affect relationships.
And personality developing over time.
Yes, that too. His emphasis that personality isn't fixed but develops throughout life was a pretty significant contribution.
Fascinating. So, while Freud was digging into the unconscious, a very different school of thought was emerging, one focused entirely on what we can see.
Precisely. Early 20th century, John B. Watson really spearheaded the behaviorist movement. He argued, quite forcefully, that trying to study the inner workings of the mind objectively was, well, just not possible.
If you can't observe it, you can't study it scientifically.
That was his stance. So instead of introspection and talking about inner feelings, behaviorism turned its attention solely to observable behavior, what people do.
So behaviorism is basically about observing and controlling behavior.
Exactly. The focus shifted entirely to understanding how we learn through our interactions with the environment, examining learned behaviors and how they might interact with our innate qualities.
And a lot of the early work used animals, didn't it? Rats in mazes and that sort of thing.
Yes, behaviorists frequently used animal models. They operated under the assumption that the basic principles of learning were pretty universal across species.
And easier to study in a controlled lab setting, I guess.
Right. The idea was to identify fundamental laws of learning that could then, hopefully, be applied to understand human behavior.
Then came B.F. Skinner, another huge name in behaviorism.
Right. Skinner built on Watson's foundation. He focused intently on how the consequences of our actions, positive or negative, shape whether we repeat those actions.
Reinforcement and punishment.
Those were the key concepts he introduced. The primary drivers, he argued, of learned behavior.
And the Skinner box was his invention for studying this.
Absolutely. The Skinner box, or operant conditioning chamber, was ingeniously designed. It allowed for the precise study of how behavior is modified by its consequences in a very controlled way.
Like the rat pressing a lever for food.
Exactly. A direct link between a specific behavior and its outcome, allowing researchers to meticulously track learning.
So we've got these two major forces, psychoanalysis looking inward, behaviorism looking outward. But psychology didn't stop there.
No, indeed. Many psychologists felt that both perspectives offered, well, an incomplete picture of the human experience.
How so?
They felt Freud's view was perhaps too pessimistic and deterministic, all about unconscious drives, while behaviorism seemed overly simplistic, reducing complex humans to just responses to the environment.
And this dissatisfaction paved the way for humanism, a more, maybe optimistic view.
Exactly. Humanism emerged as a really powerful third force. It emphasized the inherent goodness and potential for growth within all individuals. People like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers were key figures here.
So a shift towards personal agency, our drive to become our best selves.
Precisely. Humanism placed strong emphasis on conscious experience, personal control, intentionality, and this belief that humans have an intrinsic motivation towards positive growth, towards fulfilling their potential. Self-actualization.
Okay, so humanism brings the focus back to the individual's subjective experience, and then we get the cognitive revolution.
Yes, around the 1950s, there was another significant shift, a renewed focus on the mind, but this time as an active processor of information.
What fueled that shift?
It was fueled by exciting developments in related fields, linguistics, neuroscience, and especially the burgeoning field of computer science, which offered new metaphors, new ways of thinking about mental processes, like the mind as a computer.
And this led to cognitive psychology.
Exactly. Cognitive psychology is the study of our cognitions, our thoughts, memories, perceptions, language, problem solving, and how these internal processes influence our experiences and actions.
So looking inside the black box that behaviorism ignored.
Pretty much, yeah. Exploring those mental processes directly. Ulrich Neisser's 1967 book, Cognitive Psychology, was really seminal. And linguist Noam Chomsky was also incredibly influential in challenging behaviorist ideas about language acquisition.
It's interesting how these schools of thought build on or react against each other like a conversation across decades.
Absolutely. Psychology's history is very much a dynamic interplay of ideas. And the cognitive revolution, in a way, reconnected American psychology with European psychology, too.
How so?
European psychology had generally maintained a greater interest in internal mental states, less dominated by strict behaviorism. So this cognitive shift kind of reopened lines of communication.
And it became more interdisciplinary.
Yes, the emphasis on information processing naturally led to collaborations, giving rise to the broader field of cognitive science, psychology, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, neuroscience, all working together.
Okay, so from these foundational perspectives, psychology has really branched out today into a diverse set of fields.
It really has. Contemporary psychology covers a huge range of specialized areas. You have biological psychology, for instance, looking at the biological bases of behavior, brain, nervous system, genetics.
Sensation and perception, too.
Right, how we receive and interpret sensory info. And cognitive psychology, of course, remains central thought and behavior. Then there's developmental psychology.
Studying changes across the lifespan.
Exactly, from infancy right through to old age. Personality psychology looks at those unique, enduring patterns of behavior, thought, and emotion that make us individuals. Social psychology investigates how we interact with others.
And then there are the more applied fields.
Loads of them. Industrial and organizational, or IO psychology, applies principles to the workplace. Health psychology focuses on psychological factors in physical health.
Sport and exercise psychology.
Yep. Mental aspects of performance, motivation, benefits of exercise, and of course, clinical psychology diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders.
And counseling psychology, which is maybe more focused on everyday challenges.
Exactly. Counseling psychology helps people navigate stressors, improve well-being, often with individuals who are generally psychologically healthy but facing difficulties. Then there's forensic psychology, applying psych principles within the legal system.
Wow, it's incredibly broad. So, given this vast landscape, how do psychologists actually do the research? How do they study all this?
Ah, yes, research methods. That's absolutely fundamental.
It's the backbone, right? The systematic way we gather evidence to separate facts from opinions, what we think is true from what the data actually shows.
Precisely. And it revolves around the scientific method. This involves both deductive reasoning, starting with a theory, and testing it, and inductive reasoning, making observations that lead to new ideas. It's a cycle.
And there are different ways to approach the research, different tools in the toolbox.
Exactly. Psychologists use a variety of approaches depending on the question. For instance, clinical or case studies.
Like studying one person or maybe a small group in great detail.
Yes, like the amazing case of Krista and Tatiana Hogan, the conjoined twins. You get incredibly rich, deep information. The downside is it can be hard to generalize those findings to everyone else.
Then there's just observing people in their natural habitat, so to speak.
Naturalistic observation, watching behavior as it unfolds naturally. Say, kids on a playground. You get real-life data, which is great, but you have very little control over the situation.
Is there a more controlled observation?
Yes, structured observation. That's where researchers set up a specific task or situation to observe behavior, like Ainsworth's strange situation study looking at infant attachment. More control, but potentially less natural behavior.
Surveys are obviously very common, too.
Very. Surveys gather data using lists of questions, either written or interviews. Great for getting data from large samples. That's a subset of the larger population you're interested in.
Easy to reach lots of people.
Definitely. But you might not get the same depth of information as with other methods, and people might not always answer accurately.
And researchers can also use data that already exists.
Right, archival research. Using existing records, maybe census data, medical records, social media posts. No direct interaction with participants needed, but you're limited by whatever data was collected originally.
What about tracking changes over time?
For that, you typically use longitudinal research, studying the same group of people over an extended period. Excellent for seeing how things develop or change.
But sounds time-consuming and expensive.
It definitely can be. Think about studies following people for decades, like some big cancer prevention studies.
Is there a quicker way to compare different age groups?
Yes, cross-sectional research. You compare different segments of the population, say, groups of 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds all at the same time. Much faster, but differences might be due to generational factors, not just age.
Okay. Now, we often hear about correlations in psychological research.
Ah, yes, correlational research. This looks for relationships between two or more variables. It tells us if they tend to vary together.
So, like, as one goes up, the other goes up.
That would be a positive correlation. Or, as one goes up, the other goes down, a negative correlation. We measure this strength and direction with a correlation coefficient.
But, and this is the important bit, correlation doesn't equal causation, right?
Absolutely crucial point. Just because two things are correlated doesn't mean one causes the other. There might be a third factor involved.
The classic example being ice cream sales and crime rates.
Exactly. They're often positively correlated. Both go up in summer. But it's not the ice cream causing crime, or vice versa. It's likely the third variable, hot weather, influencing both.
So, to figure out cause and effect, you need experiments.
Precisely. Experimental research is the only method that can really determine cause and effect relationships.
How does that work, basically?
The basic design involves manipulating one variable, the independent variable, to see its effect on another variable, the dependent variable. You typically have an experimental group that gets the manipulation and a control group that doesn't.
And you try to keep everything else the same between the groups.
Yes, controlling for confounding variables is key. Anything else that might affect the outcome needs to be held constant or randomized.
What about biases? Like the researcher expecting a certain result?
Good point. That's experimenter bias. It can be minimized using single-blind studies where the participants don't know if they're in the experimental or control group, or even double-blind studies where neither the participants nor the researchers interacting with them know who is in which group.
And the placebo effect, where just thinking you're getting treated helps.
Right. That's why the control group often receives a placebo, an inactive substance or treatment that looks like the real thing. It helps isolate the true effect of the independent variable.
And how do you make sure the people in the study represent the wider population?
That's where random sampling comes in. selecting participants randomly from the population of interest. And random assignment to groups helps ensure the groups are equivalent at the start.
Then you analyze the results.
Yes, using statistical analysis to determine if the differences observed between the groups are statistically significant, meaning unlikely to be due to random chance alone.
It's also vital that the tools used to measure things are good, right?
Absolutely essential. Data collection tools need to be reliable, giving consistent results, and valid, actually measuring what they're supposed to measure.
And other scientists check the work.
Yes. The peer review process is critical. Experts in the field evaluate research before it's published. And replication, other researchers trying to repeat the study to see if they get similar results, builds confidence in the findings.
Okay, so we have all these methods, but running research, especially with people, involves ethical considerations. Big ones.
You're absolutely right. Ethical considerations are paramount in modern psychological research. They're not just suggestions, they're requirements.
And there are committees that oversee this.
Yes, any institution conducting research, like a university, will have an institutional review board, or IRB. They review all research proposals involving human participants to ensure ethical guidelines are met and participants are protected.
A key part of that is informed consent, isn't it?
Absolutely central. Informed consent means participants must voluntarily agree to participate after being fully informed about the study's purpose, procedures, any potential risks, potential benefits, and their right to withdraw at any time without penalty. And they need to understand this info.
But sometimes, don't researchers need to hide the true purpose, at least initially?
Yes, sometimes deception might be necessary to prevent participants' knowledge from biasing the results. However, it's strictly regulated. It can only be used if it's essential, justified, and doesn't involve significant harm or withholding information about risks.
And if deception is used?
Then a thorough debriefing is mandatory afterwards. Participants must be told the true nature of the study, why deception was used, and given a chance to ask questions. Any misconceptions must be cleared up.
These strict rules likely came about because of past research that wasn't so ethical.
Sadly, yes. Historical examples like the Tuskegee syphilis study, where treatment was withheld from black men with syphilis for decades, serve as stark reminders of why rigorous ethical oversight is crucial. We learned hard lessons.
And Milgram's obedience studies raised ethical questions too, right? Deception, psychological distress.
Exactly. Milgram's studies, while providing profound insights into obedience, sparked intense debate about deception, the participants' right to withdraw easily, and the potential for psychological harm. These controversies heavily influenced the development of stricter ethical guidelines.
Is there a core set of principles guiding this?
Yes. The Belmont Report in the U.S. outlined key principles: respect for persons, including informed consent, beneficence, maximizing benefits, minimizing harm, and justice, fair distribution of risks and benefits. There are also guidelines covering things like handling data confidentially, intellectual property, and ensuring participants aren't coerced.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, with all these areas in research, what kinds of careers can people pursue in psychology?
It's incredibly varied. The educational path really depends on the specific career goal. For many specialized roles, particularly in academia or as a licensed clinical psychologist, a doctoral degree is usually required.
That's a PhD or a CSID.
Right. A PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, often has a stronger research emphasis, requiring a dissertation, a large original research project. A CACD, Doctor of Psychology, tends to focus more on clinical practice skills. Both typically take several years post-bachelor's.
What about a master's degree?
A master's degree, usually taking about 2 years, can qualify you for various roles. Things like school psychology, some counseling positions, roles in IO psychology, or teaching at community colleges.
And just a bachelor's degree in psychology, does that lead anywhere?
It definitely provides a valuable foundation. While it doesn't typically qualify you for independent practice as a psychologist, it opens doors to many fields: case management, human resources, market research, sales, social work support roles. It's also great preparation for graduate study.
You mentioned the MCAT earlier.
Yes. Psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior are actually part of the MCAT now, the test for medical school admission, highlighting its relevance.
And for those wanting to practice therapy, like clinical or counseling psychologists, there's a licensing process after the doctorate.
Yes, absolutely. After getting the doctorate, you need a certain amount of supervised clinical experience, and then you have to pass a national licensing exam and often a state-specific one, too.
It's important to distinguish them from psychiatrists, right?
Crucial distinction. Clinical psychologists typically have a PhD or TSID and focus on assessment and therapy. Psychiatrists are medical doctors, MDs, who specialize in mental health. They can prescribe medication, which psychologists generally cannot, though there are some exceptions in a few places now.
So a PhD could lead to being a researcher, a professor, a consultant, a therapist.
Exactly. Or maybe a biopsychologist working in pharmaceuticals. Or a forensic psychologist consulting with the courts. Many options. And undergrad psych coursework is relevant for related fields too, like psychiatric social work or nursing.
Psychology also gives us huge insights into how we develop throughout our lives. Lifespan development seems like a really core area.
It absolutely is. Lifespan development studies the physical, cognitive, and psychosocial changes we experience across the entire lifespan, from conception right through to death. And several major theorists have really shaped our understanding here.
Like Piaget.
Yes, Jean Piaget has influential stage theory of cognitive development. He described how children's thinking changes from the sensoromotor stage based on senses and actions through pre-operational, concrete operational, up to the formal operational stage involving abstract thought. He also talked about assimilation and accommodation, how we fit new information into our existing ideas or change our ideas.
And Vygotsky had a different take, emphasizing social factors.
Lev Vygotsky did, yes. His sociocultural theory stressed the fundamental role of social interaction in culture and cognitive development. Learning happens socially first, then individually. Concepts like the zone of proximal development come from him.
Erikson focused more on the social and emotional side.
Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory proposed 8 stages across the lifespan, each defined by a specific psychosocial crisis or task, like trust versus mistrust in infancy or identity versus role confusion in adolescence. Resolving these shapes our personality.
And Kohlberg looked at morality.
Lawrence Kohlberg developed a theory of moral development, suggesting we progress through stages in how we reason about right and wrong, often assessed using hypothetical moral dilemmas. And as we mentioned with research methods, developmental psychologists often use longitudinal or cross-sectional designs to study these changes.
Another really central area you mentioned is personality. What makes us unique?
Yes, personality psychology focuses on those enduring patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior that make each person distinct. The contemporary approach often involves identifying and measuring specific personality traits quantitatively.
And the Big Five model is pretty dominant there.
It's certainly the most widely accepted framework right now. The 5-factor model proposes 5 broad dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, often remembered by the acronym OCEAN.
And these traits are relatively stable, have a genetic basis?
Research suggests they are relatively stable throughout adulthood and have a significant heritable component, though environment plays a role too, of course.
Okay, and we touched on social psychology before, how we interact with others.
Right. Social psychology looks at how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. It covers a huge range of attitudes: prejudice, attraction, group behavior, aggression, helping.
And Milgram's obedience study falls under this.
Yes, a classic, albeit controversial example is social psychological research into social influence, and as we discussed, a major driver for developing stricter ethical guidelines in research.
And briefly, sport and exercise psychology.
That applies psychological principles to improve sport performance, understand motivation and anxiety in athletes, and also looks at the psychological benefits of exercise and physical activity for everyone.
And finally, circling back to clinical psychology.
Right, the area focused on the diagnosis, assessment, and treatment of psychological disorders and promoting mental health. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is one very prominent and effective approach used today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into psychology, it's just striking how vast and multifaceted this field really is.
It truly is. From its philosophical roots, wrestling with consciousness, to its current status as a rigorous evidence-based science, psychology offers such invaluable insights into, well, the human condition.
And that commitment we talked about to sound research methods and solid ethical principles seems absolutely crucial for its progress.
Absolutely. They are the bedrock. That's how we advance our understanding responsibly and ensure we're helping, not harming.
And it's also clear there are just so many different ways people can apply this knowledge, so many career paths.
Definitely. The skills you gain studying psychology, critical thinking, understanding behavior, research skills are applicable almost everywhere.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. How might understanding these different perspectives, the psychoanalytic, the behavioral, the cognitive, the humanistic, and the methods psychologists use, change how you view behavior? both your own and what you see in the world around you. What everyday things might you look at now through a new psychological lens?
Something to ponder.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.